In 1929, an 8-year-old Navajo boy named Chester Nez was taken from his grandmother's sheep farm in northwestern New Mexico and placed in a government boarding school run by the United States Bureau of Indian Affairs. He did not speak English. He spoke Navajo, the only language anyone in his family or his community had ever spoken to him. He had never been to a school. He had been born in a hogan, the traditional Navajo dwelling, and had spent the first 8 years of his life herding sheep and goats with his grandparents, his sister, and his older brother. On his first day at the boarding school, the staff gave him a new name. His Navajo name was difficult for white teachers to pronounce, so they assigned him an English name. They picked it from a list of American presidents. The boy from New Mexico became Chester, after Chester A. Arthur, the 21st President of the United States. And then they made the rules clear. He was forbidden to speak Navajo, not in the classroom, not at meals, not in the dormitory, not at any hour of any day on the school grounds. If he was caught speaking his own language, he would be beaten. If he was caught a second time, he would be locked in a closet. His mouth would sometimes be washed out with brown lye soap, a caustic detergent that burned the skin and left the inside of his mouth raw for days afterward. This was the official policy of the United States government in 1929, applied uniformly to Navajo, Apache, Hopi, Lakota, Cherokee, and dozens of other Native American children removed from their families and placed in federal boarding schools. The stated goal in government publications of the era was to make these children forget who they were. The policy was named, with bureaucratic frankness, cultural assimilation through linguistic eradication. Chester Nez attended one of those boarding schools, on and off, for 9 years. In May of 1942, when Chester Nez was 21 years old and a high school student at the Tuba City boarding school in northern Arizona, a United States Marine Corps recruiter appeared on the school grounds. The recruiter was looking for Navajo men who were fluent in both English and Navajo. The recruiter did not say what the work would be. He said only that the Marines needed bilingual Navajos for a special assignment, that the work would be classified, and that the men who volunteered would be among the first all-Native American platoon in Marine Corps history. Chester Nez raised his hand. 3 weeks later, at Camp Elliott in California, a Marine major took Chester Nez and 28 other young Navajo men into a locked room. The major told them what their mission was. They were going to use the Navajo language, the language they had been beaten, punished, and humiliated for speaking every day of their childhoods by the same United States government that was now ordering them to use it, to create a battlefield code that the Japanese could not break. Chester Nez and the other 28 men sat in that room, locked, for 13 weeks. They created the code. They memorized it. They became the first generation of what the United States Marine Corps would call, with belated and accumulated pride, the Navajo Code Talkers. Between 1942 and 1945, Chester Nez and 400 other Navajo Marines, who eventually served as code talkers, participated in every single major marine assault in the Pacific: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Bougainville, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima. The code they had built in 13 weeks in a locked room, using the language the government had spent a century trying to beat out of them, was never broken. When the war ended, the United States government classified the code. The code talkers were sworn to secrecy. They were told that the code might be needed in future wars, that they could not tell their families, their friends, their wives, or their children what they had actually done in the Pacific. They were ordered to say, if anyone asked, that they had been radio operators. That was all. The order held for 23 years. In 1968, the United States government finally declassified the Navajo Code. Chester Nez, by then 47 years old, working as a painter at a Veterans Affairs hospital in Albuquerque, was finally allowed to tell his wife and his children what he had done in the war. He was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal on July 26, 2001. He was 79 years old. He had waited 59 years, from the day his teachers first beat him for speaking Navajo, to be officially thanked by his country for speaking it. He died on June 4, 2014, at the age of 93. He was the last surviving member of the original 29. Chester Nez was born on January 23, 1921, in a hogan on the Navajo reservation in a place called Chichilta, New Mexico. Chichilta in Navajo means two wells. His mother died when he was 3 years old. He was raised primarily by his grandparents, with help from his father and his older sister. The family lived a traditional Navajo life. They were members of the Black Sheep clan on his mother's side. They herded sheep and goats on the checkerboard region of the reservation, a stretch of land in northwestern New Mexico where the federal government in the 19th century had carved the reservation up into alternating squares of public and private land, like the squares of a chessboard. Chester grew up speaking Navajo. He learned the traditional prayers. He learned the cycles of sheep husbandry, when to lamb, when to shear, and when to move the flock to fresh grazing. He learned to read weather by the angle of the wind off the continental divide. He did not, before the age of 8, know more than a handful of English words. And then, in 1929, the federal government sent him to school. The Indian boarding school system, formally established by federal legislation in the 1870s and expanded continuously through the early 20th century, was based on a stated educational philosophy first articulated by the American Army officer who founded the model, Brigadier General Richard Henry Pratt. Pratt, in an 1892 speech, summarized the philosophy in a single sentence that would be quoted, both proudly and damningly, for the next century. Kill the Indian, save the man. Pratt's argument, sincerely intended as a humanitarian alternative to the prevailing federal policy of outright extermination, was that Native American children could be successfully integrated into white American society if they were removed from their families at a young age and stripped, methodically, of every cultural marker that identified them as Indian. The language, the clothing, the religion, the hair, the food, the names. All of it had to go. Chester Nez was taken to a boarding school in Tohatchi, New Mexico, in the fall of 1929. He was 8 years old. His sister Dora was sent with him. They had never been separated from their grandparents. They had never been in a building larger than a single-room hogan. They had never eaten food that was not from their family's own flock. What they encountered in Tohatchi was a system designed, with practiced efficiency, to make them forget who they were. Their hair was cut. Their traditional clothes were taken away and burned. They were given English names, Chester, after the dead president. They were given English uniforms. They were marched in lines. They were forbidden to speak Navajo, on penalty of physical punishment that, in some schools, escalated to beating with leather straps, confinement in unheated closets, and the lye soap mouth washes that left students unable to eat for days. After Chester's first year at Tohatchi, his family discovered that the children were not being adequately fed. The food was minimal in quantity and poor in quality. Many students were malnourished. Several were dying of preventable diseases. Chester's grandparents pulled him and Dora out of Tohatchi and arranged for them to attend a different boarding school at Fort Defiance, Arizona, which had a better food reputation but the same disciplinary policies. Chester stayed at Fort Defiance for several years. He learned English. He completed elementary school. He continued to be punished for speaking Navajo. The punishments did not stop until he was old enough that the staff stopped catching him at it. He moved eventually to a high school at Tuba City, Arizona, where he was attending 10th grade when Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Chester Nez was 20 years old. He had spent 12 of his last 13 years inside federal boarding schools designed to teach him that his own language was inferior, primitive, and unsuitable for use in modern society. When the United States Marine Corps recruiter showed up at Tuba City 5 months later, in April 1942, looking for bilingual Navajos for a classified assignment, Chester Nez was one of the first to volunteer. He did not know what the assignment was. He knew only, as he would say decades later in one of his final interviews, that his country had been attacked, and that he was a Navajo, and that Navajos were warriors. He said, "Somebody's got to defend this country. Somebody's got to defend the freedom." This is the reason why I went. The idea to use the Navajo language as a military code did not come from the Navajo Nation. It came from a 50-year-old white American civilian named Philip Johnston, who had grown up on the Navajo reservation as the son of a Protestant missionary who spoke fluent Navajo and who was one of approximately 30 non-Navajos in the entire world who understood the language at all. Johnston had served in the United States Army during the First World War. He knew that the American military, during that war, had used members of the Choctaw Nation as code talkers to send tactical messages in their own language, a system that had worked because German intelligence had no access to any Choctaw speakers anywhere in Europe. The Choctaw program had been small, ad hoc, and lightly documented. Johnston believed Navajo would be even more secure. The Navajo language was unwritten. It had no published dictionary. It used a tonal system with 4 distinct tones that completely changed the meaning of identical-sounding words. It had a grammatical structure unlike any European language. And it was spoken by, at most, 50,000 people on Earth, almost all of them living within a roughly 300-mile radius in the American Southwest. Johnston pitched the idea to Major General Clayton Vogel, commanding officer of the Marine Corps Amphibious Force Pacific, in February 1942. Vogel was skeptical. Johnston staged a demonstration. He brought 4 Navajo men into a Marine communications office, gave them a sample combat message in English, and timed how long it took them to encode it, transmit it, and decode it on the other end. The result startled Vogel. A 3-line tactical message that, using existing American military encryption machines, took approximately 30 minutes to encode, transmit, and decode, took the Navajo speakers approximately 20 seconds. Vogel approved the program on the spot. In April 1942, the Marine Corps sent recruiters to Navajo schools and trading posts across Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, looking for bilingual Navajo men between the ages of 17 and 30. They were not told what they would be doing. They were told only that they would be Marines, that the work was secret, and that they would be the first all-Native American platoon in Marine Corps history. Approximately 250 Navajo men applied at Fort Defiance, New Mexico, in the spring of 1942. 29 were selected. They became Platoon 382 of the United States Marine Corps Recruit Training Depot at San Diego. Chester Nez was one of those 29. After basic training at San Diego, a 13-week boot camp that Chester would later describe as easier than boarding school had been, because at least at boot camp the Marines did not punish him for being Navajo. The original 29 were transferred to Camp Elliott, north of San Diego, in August 1942. They still did not know what their assignment was. They had been told that they would do communications work. They assumed this meant radio repair, or wire laying, or the kind of clerical signal duty that uneducated recruits were often assigned. What happened next was, in every memoir written by every surviving member of the original 29, the moment when they understood that something extraordinary was about to be asked of them. A Marine major took the 29 men into a large empty room. He closed the door behind him. He locked it. He told them they were going to develop a code in their own native language. Then, he left. Chester Nez would later describe in his memoir what those first minutes inside the locked room felt like. He said the 29 men sat in silence for several minutes, looking at each other, trying to figure out if the major had been serious. The order made no sense. They had spent their childhoods being told that Navajo was a useless language, suitable only for primitive people, unsuited to modern thought. They had been beaten for speaking it. They had been told it had no future. Their own children, if they were to succeed in white America, would need to forget it. And now the Marine Corps was locking them in a room and telling them to build a battlefield code with it. Once they accepted that the order was real, they got to work. They worked for 13 weeks. They had no textbooks. They had no precedents. They had no access to professional cryptographers. They were 29 young men, most of them in their early 20s. Most of them with high school educations interrupted by the war, working in a locked room at a Marine Corps base in Southern California, building from scratch a coding system that the United States Marine Corps would use, without modification of its core structure, for the rest of the Second World War. They designed what cryptographers would later call a two-layer encryption system. The first layer was an alphabetic substitution. Each letter of the English alphabet was assigned 1, 2, or 3 Navajo words, each one representing a different concept that began with that letter. The letter A could be expressed as Wolache, meaning ant, or Belasana, meaning apple, or Tsenil, meaning axe. A code talker on the receiving end would translate each Navajo word back into English, take only the first letter of the English word, and assemble the message letter by letter. The second layer was a vocabulary substitution. Approximately 450 common military terms, battleship, submarine, fighter plane, mortar, machine gun, casualty, were assigned single Navajo words. A battleship was Lotso, meaning whale. A submarine was Beshlo, meaning iron fish. A destroyer was Kalo, meaning shark. A fighter plane was Dahetihi, meaning hummingbird. The resulting code was, in cryptographic terms, almost impossible to break without prior knowledge of both the Navajo language and the specific code talker vocabulary. The Japanese, who employed some of the most skilled code breakers in the world during the war, and who had successfully broken every other American battlefield code at some point during the conflict, never broke the Navajo code. The Japanese chief of military intelligence, Lieutenant General Seizo Arisue, would admit after the war that his cryptographers had concluded the Marine messages were not, in fact, a code at all. They had assumed it was some kind of jammed signal or scrambled audio, because the linguistic patterns matched no language any of his analysts had ever heard. Chester Nez and the original 29 completed the code in October 1942. Most of them were rushed immediately afterward to active combat units in the Pacific. Chester Nez was assigned to the 1st Marine Division. He boarded a troop ship at San Diego in early November 1942 and sailed for an island most of the men on the ship had never heard of before. It was called Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was, by the time Chester Nez arrived in November 1942, 3 months into one of the bloodiest sustained engagements of the Pacific War. The 1st Marine Division had landed on the island in August. They had taken catastrophic casualties. They were running out of ammunition, food, and replacements. The Japanese were counterattacking nightly. The American command on the ground was, by some accounts, weeks away from being overrun. Chester Nez stepped off a landing craft onto the beach at Guadalcanal 3 months after his 21st birthday. The first radio transmission he made in Navajo code, sending coordinates for an American artillery strike on a Japanese machine gun position, landed the strike on target and destroyed the gun crew within minutes. He would remember that moment, decades later, as the proudest of his combat service. He had used the language he had been beaten for speaking to save the lives of American Marines who, 12 months earlier, would not have hired him for a job, would not have rented him a room, would not have served him at a lunch counter, would not have called him a citizen. He stayed on Guadalcanal for the remainder of the campaign. He moved on to Bougainville with the 3rd Marine Division in 1943. He fought at Guam in the summer of 1944, where he was wounded in the foot by Japanese shrapnel. He fought at Peleliu in the autumn of 1944 in one of the most brutal sustained beach assaults of the entire Pacific War. He fought at Angar. At every battle, the code talkers worked in 2-man teams. One man operated the radio. The other man sent and received the Navajo messages. The work was continuous. The code talkers were typically attached to battalion, regimental, or division headquarters communications sections. When not transmitting code, they performed general radio duties or served as riflemen alongside other Marines. And every time a code talker keyed his microphone and began speaking Navajo over an open military radio frequency, somewhere in the same battlefield, a Japanese intercept operator was listening. The Japanese intercepted thousands of Navajo code transmissions during the war. They recorded them. They sent the recordings to their cryptographic headquarters in Tokyo. They tortured captured Navajo army soldiers, Navajos who were not code talkers, who did not know the code, but who were nevertheless able to recognize the underlying language, trying to extract the meaning of the broadcasts. The torture did not work. The cryptographers did not crack the code. The recordings remained, throughout the war, an indecipherable string of Navajo nouns referring to animals and household objects, with no apparent military significance to any analyst who heard them. By the time the Marines reached Iwo Jima in February 1945, the Code Talker program had been operating for 2.5 years and had been used in every major Marine assault in the Pacific. The Marines had become entirely dependent on it. Major Howard Connor, the signal officer of the 5th Marine Division during the assault on Iwo Jima, would write in his after-action report that during the first 48 hours of the battle, when the entire Marine landing was happening simultaneously on a stretch of black volcanic sand barely 2 miles long, he had 6 Navajo code talkers operating 6 radio nets around the clock. They sent and received over 800 coded messages during those 48 hours. Not a single message was sent or received in error. Connor's after-action assessment, written shortly after the battle and later published in declassified Marine Corps records, became the most quoted sentence in the entire history of the Code Talker program. "Were it not for the Navajos," he wrote, "the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." Chester Nez did not fight at Iwo Jima. He had been with the 1st and 3rd Marine Divisions, which were not part of the Iwo Jima assault force. But several of the original 29 were there, and they did the work that Major Connor would later credit. Chester Nez was honorably discharged from the Marine Corps in January 1946. He came home to New Mexico by bus from San Francisco, with 5 months of accumulated back pay in his pocket and a sea bag containing his uniform, his shaving kit, and a few personal effects. He arrived in Gallup, New Mexico. He went to the federal building to apply for a Native American identity card, which the federal government required all reservation residents to carry. The civil servant on duty looked at his discharge papers, looked at him, and told him he was not a full citizen of the United States. It was true. New Mexico did not grant Native Americans the right to vote until 1948. Arizona did not grant it until 1948 either. Utah did not grant it until 1957. Chester Nez had spent 3.5 years in the Pacific War, had used his Navajo language to save American lives in 5 major amphibious assaults, had received 3 combat campaign ribbons, and had come home to a country that, in the state where he had been born, did not legally consider him a voter. He went back to the reservation. He helped his grandparents with the sheep. He suffered, like many returning Pacific veterans, from what would today be called severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He had nightmares. He could not sleep. He saw in waking hours the bodies of the Marines he had carried off beaches in the Solomon Islands. His father arranged a traditional Navajo healing ceremony conducted by a tribal medicine man intended to release the trauma that combat had left in him. The ceremony, Chester would later say in interviews, worked. The nightmares lessened. He was able to sleep again. He was able to function. He enrolled at the University of Kansas on the GI Bill in 1947. He studied fine art. He earned a degree in painting and commercial illustration. He returned to New Mexico in the early 1950s. He was called back to active duty during the Korean War in 1951. He served in the Marine Corps Reserves, stationed in Hawaii and Idaho, and was discharged for the second time in 1952. He came home to New Mexico for the second time. He married a Navajo woman named Ethel. They had several children. He found a job as a painter and muralist at the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Albuquerque, painting walls and decorative panels for a salary that was, in 1953, approximately $2,000 a year. He worked at that hospital for the next 25 years. And during those 25 years, through Korea, through the McCarthy era, through the Civil Rights Movement, through Vietnam, through the cultural upheavals of the 1960s, Chester Nez did not, could not, was forbidden to tell anyone what he had actually done in the Pacific. The Code Talker program had been classified by the Marine Corps in 1945. The classification was renewed repeatedly through the post-war decades because the United States military was still considering using Navajo code in potential future conflicts. The Cold War made the classification seem permanent. The Korean War made it seem operationally relevant. By the early 1960s, when the surviving code talkers were beginning to reach middle age, the classification had become, in their daily lives, a kind of accumulated silence that they were unable to break. Chester Nez could not tell his wife Ethel what he had done. He could not tell his children. He could not tell his fellow employees at the Veterans Affairs Hospital, several of whom were also veterans of the same war. He could not tell the men he played cards with at the American Legion Hall on Friday nights. He could not put any of it in writing. He could not even, in moments of stress, acknowledge to himself out loud that the war he had fought had been won. In part, with the language his teachers had beaten him for speaking when he was 8 years old. In 1968, the United States Department of Defense finally declassified the Navajo Code. Chester Nez was 47 years old. He had been holding the secret for 23 years. He went home that evening. He told Ethel and his children what he had done in the war. They cried. They asked questions for hours. He answered them. Ethel, his wife, would later say in an interview, decades after Chester's death, that she had always suspected he had done more in the war than he had been allowed to admit. She said the silence had been the hardest part, not knowing, never being able to ask, never being allowed to be proud of him in public for the thing that he had actually done. She said the night the code was declassified, the first night they could finally talk about it, was the night their marriage truly began. They had been married for 15 years at that point. Recognition came slowly. President Richard Nixon sent a letter of appreciation to the Navajo Tribal Council in 1971. Code Talker veterans were invited to walk at the head of the United States Bicentennial Parade in Washington, D.C. in 1976. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan signed a proclamation establishing August 14th, the anniversary of Japan's surrender in 1945, as National Navajo Code Talkers Day. But the formal honor, the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the United States Congress can bestow, did not come until July 26, 2001. 59 years after the original 29 had been locked in that room at Camp Elliott to build a code that won a war. 5 of the original 29 were still alive to receive the medal from President George W. Bush in person at a ceremony at the United States Capitol. Chester Nez was one of them. The other 24 medals were awarded posthumously. Chester Nez wore his Marine Corps dress uniform to the ceremony. He saluted the President of the United States. He shook the President's hand. He stood, 80 years old, in front of a crowd of dignitaries and reporters and television cameras in the rotunda of the Capitol building. And he listened to President Bush say, in remarks that would be broadcast nationally that evening, that the Code Talker story was a story of one unbreakable oral code of the Second World War, messages traveling by field radio on Iwo Jima in the very language heard across the Colorado Plateau centuries ago. It is a story, Bush said, that all Americans can celebrate and every American should know. Chester Nez wrote a memoir in 2011 with a co-author named Judith Schiess Avila. It was the first published memoir by any of the original 29. It was titled with the same blunt simplicity he had used to describe everything else in his life, Code Talker. He gave his final interview to the American Legion magazine on May 25, 2014. The interviewer asked him if he had any final message for the Marines currently serving overseas. Chester Nez, 93 years old, sat up straighter in his chair. He said, "All you Marines out there, wherever you are, come home in one piece. As Corporal Chester Nez, I say to you guys that are out there, Semper Fidelis, take care, and come home." He died at his home in Albuquerque 10 days later, on June 4, 2014, of kidney failure. He was buried at the Santa Fe National Cemetery in Marine dress blues, with full military honors. He was the last surviving member of the original 29. He had outlived every person he had been locked in that room with at Camp Elliott in August 1942. He had outlived every classified order that had been imposed on him. He had outlived, in the end, the silence itself, and the language he had spoken into a Marine field radio at Guadalcanal in November 1942. The language he had been beaten for speaking when he was 8 years old in a federal boarding school in northwestern New Mexico was the same language that he, an old man now, used to speak the traditional Navajo prayer before each of his meals in his home in Albuquerque every day until the day he died.